Okay, today what I'm going to do is uh, talk a little bit about uh, theories of trade so that you can get some idea about what's the thinking behind trade policy. So the earliest thinking around trade were these people called mercantilists. And what they basically said, the more gold that you have, the richer you are and the better the country is going to be. And the way you get gold was to export and let someone else buy you. And those days you paid in gold. And so it was called mercantilism because they wanted to get as much gold as they possible through exports. There was a little flaw in their thinking because it's something called a zero-sum game. If there's only one winner and one loser, what's going to happen with the loser? So you can't just keep exporting and not import from others and share the wealth. So you would have a run into the first problem of the other party not being able to be in a position to buy anymore. But also, they forgot that the more money you come into the system, the more chances that you'll have inflation. Because now you have all the gold in your economy, and what are you going to buy with it? And if there's not enough things to buy, inflation would happen. So that's when some of these ideas of mercantilists that just export and just get gold didn't work well. And so anybody who has these kinds of ideas today, just pure export without importing, is known as a neo-mercantilist. Now, then the ideas progressed, and this guy named Adam Smith came on the picture and says, the reason why we are having trade and why we're exporting is because we have an absolute advantage in producing something. So we can produce things absolutely cheaper than somebody else, and so we export it. What he could not explain was why would Europe and America trade in cars? They're trading in the same products. So how can it be that both countries can do something? And so one of the explanations came up with Ricardo, and he had this theory of trade that is not the absolute cost advantage that determines trade, but the relative cost. Relative cost is the opportunity cost. What do you give up to get something else? Why doesn't Bill Gates bend down to pick a $100 bill? Because he can make more money doing something else, right? So every country is faced with a choice. Should we produce cars or should we produce clothing? And so Ricardo said, when they look at the relative cost of producing cars versus computers or cars versus clothing, one country could find that it is relatively cheaper to produce cars and not to produce clothes, and to export it and import clothes that somebody else produces cheaper. And this way, both countries benefit because they are producing things that they're good at, exporting it, and importing the goods that's more expensive to produce. And then to explain what provides this cost advantage to people, to countries, Heckscher and Olin said the reason why you have a cost advantage is you have these inputs that are needed to make that product. So why is the US good in producing computers? Because we have technology and we have high-skilled people. Why is Bangladesh good in producing textiles? Because they have a lot of people and they can produce that cheaper. So the relative cost advantage is because the relative inputs that people have. Other people try to explain trade, such as Ray and Vernon, that said, it's a typical product cycle that you invent something, everyone wants to buy it, you export it, then you are the market leader, but then people start making imitations of products like you, and so now you are, and it becomes maybe they can do it cheaper, and you end up being an importer rather than an exporter, and so trade can be explained in terms of the life cycle. Others, such as Paul Krugman, came up with a new theory of trade that explaining trade more in terms of the nature and size of firms. Like you might have huge companies like Samsung or Ford or GM, and how does competition and economies of scale, that means the cost advantage you get when you produce at large quantities, how that helps you to be the market leader and export cheaper to some parts of to other parts of the world, and import things that are relatively more expensive to produce here. And so very often it's that first mover advantage. You are the first to be able to sell that product because you have that technology. You get that first mover advantage. Very soon other people will compete and would capture your market share. And Michael Porter had a more complex explanation of trade and firm dominance in terms of the inputs, in terms of your competitive structure, and there's that famous Porter diamond that explained these many factors that come into play in different situations to give someone a competitive advantage. So those are some of the theories of economic trade that you have to keep in mind when we are debating trade policy, because behind every trade policy is this trade theory. So what are some of the ways that you can do trade policy? And there are about 7 different kinds of strategies that you can use to control trade. You can have tariffs, which is a tax on imports. You can give subsidies to your exporters to help them lower their costs. You can put a quota on the number of imports that come into the country, say the number of cars, or you could have voluntary export restraints. That means you force the other to put conditions on how much they export to the country. So you tell the Japanese on your own agree you're going to export to the US only 1 million cars. And you have a gun to their head to tell them that's what they need to do. Other people might say that in order to sell in this country, you've got to make sure that 20% or 40% is produced locally, or you're using inputs from here locally. Another kind of policies are anti-dumping policies, where you say, hey, China, you are giving too much subsidies to your companies. That's why you are having that low cost. We are going to put countervailing duties to make up for the cost advantage that your firm has. And administrative policies are rules and regulations that you might put on trade, such as plastic, no plastic, or how a product is going to be wrapped, or which particular port you can use to export something. So when you talk about trade policy, when you're trying to use any of these policies, you're not a free trader. You're wanting to protect your country or follow some kind of managed trade, either total protection or some kind of restriction on trade. And these are some of the instruments that you might use to restrict entries into your case. But if you don't like these policies, you're going to follow a free trade policy that is keeping all of these to the minimum. In fact, having none of them and only having tariffs, and then moving the tariffs downwards so that everybody could have trade. And then when we talk about trade agreements between countries, what we are trying to do is to agree on trade policy, how we can keep trade free between countries in the world. And so the World Trade Organization is that entity that's trying to get all the major countries of the world that have free market system to agree that they're going to have very low barriers to trade. And over time, they've been successful in manufactured goods, but they've not been successful in agriculture or in textiles, because there are strong interest groups aligned with them, because a lot of people are employed in those industries. Very difficult to strike an agreement because farmers or other groups will say, hey, we are hurt by foreign trade, we need protection. And lately, the latest round of the World Trade Organization is around trade and services, such as intellectual property, protection of your intellectual rights, or trade in movement of finance and capital and insurance. How could we have rules that everyone agrees on? And it's really tough to get an agreement on this. And there have been negotiations that are going on for a long time. And if you know, this is the future world, these trade and services. And if we don't have an agreement on it, there's a potential that we might have a lot of problems in the future. So that, in a nutshell, is trade theory, trade policy, and trade agreements. And what we will talk about next time is around exchange